Has the United States ever atoned for slavery? What has the United States materially done to course correct after hundreds of years of slavery and decades of Jim Crow segregation? It's a very popular thing to scoff at the idea of reparations or any sort of corrective action around this issue in this day and age. After all, none of us have ever been enslaved. We can all sit where we want on public transportation and drink from the same water fountain as anyone. But when you compare how the U.S. treated African Americans after hundreds of years of black enslavement with the way that victims of the Holocaust were treated after World War II, or the internment of Japanese Americans in the U.S., or even Native Americans, you start to notice some glaring inequities. I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. 6 million Jewish people were violently slaughtered during the Holocaust in Germany. It was one of the most brutal genocides that the world has ever known. But have you ever wondered what happened when all of that came to an end? Did everyone just go back to business as usual? Well, the issue of restitution or reparations for Jewish people has been hammered out over the many decades since the end of World War II. In the initial aftermath, no one really wanted to talk about it. But after a Jewish state was established 3 years after the end of World War II in 1948 with the support of the United Nations, suddenly Jewish people were in a position to have their demands taken more seriously. In 1951, a conference on Jewish material claims against Germany was opened in New York City by Nahum Goldman to help survivors with claims against Germany. The German government agreed to pay out $845 million to Holocaust survivors and their descendants over a period of 14 years. In 1988, over 40 years after the end of World War II, the German government paid out another $125 million in reparations to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. In 1999, German companies like Deutsche Bank, Siemens, and BMW were sued by Jewish organizations for their involvement in the Holocaust. The German government paid $5 billion on their behalf to avoid these lawsuits. In 2012, Germany paid another $772 million in reparations directly to Israel. In 2014, the SNCF, a French state-owned railway company, was forced to pay $60 million to American Jewish Holocaust survivors for transporting deportees to Germany during the Holocaust, even though they were forced to participate in these transports by the German government and didn't actually make any profits from them at all. That's another $100,000 per survivor. By 1978, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany had paid out about 53 billion Deutsche Marks to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. All in all, that organization holds $900 million in assets and has $1.7 billion in various accounts. They continue to pay reparation claims to this day, but the restitution for that awful chapter in history hasn't only been financial. The UN has designated January 27th as the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. There are dozens of Holocaust memorials and museums scattered throughout the US and Europe, and there should be. But here's the kicker. Since 1992, instruction about the Holocaust has been compulsory, starting at the 10th grade level in German schools. It's not uncommon for students to go to concentration camps or Holocaust memorials and museums for field trips. Now, in a shameful chapter of US history, 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, many of whom were American citizens, were interned in camps throughout California, Washington, and Oregon. Canada and Mexico followed suit as well. This was done as an anti-espionage effort in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack. For decades, Japanese American advocacy groups pushed for a formal apology from the U.S. government for this racist policy, as well as monetary reparations. Finally, in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, and the 80,000 survivors of this 4-year ordeal received a formal apology from President Ronald Reagan and $20,000 each. That's a total of $1.6 billion in reparations for an event that lasted 4 years. And of course, Native Americans have rightly received billions of dollars in subsidies for the theft of their land and the pillaging of their culture, wrongs that could never possibly be righted with money alone. Now, let's contrast that with how the 246-year legacy of slavery has been addressed in the United States. After the end of the Civil War, General Sherman ordered that 40 acres of land and 1 mule would be given to thousands of black families who had lived in bondage for generations. After Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, that order was rescinded and the land was returned to white Confederate landowners. And that's it. That's the extent of the payments that have been made to Black Americans to atone for the hundreds of years that millions of African Americans were enslaved on U.S. soil. Zero land, $0. Now, if you factor in affirmative action quotas, which are meant to level the playing field between Black American descendants of slavery and the rest of the population, you could argue that some effort has been made to initiate indirect reparations, though those initiatives are not nearly as far-reaching as many people would have you believe, and they are continually under threat of legal challenge. There are also many legal battles battles being waged in various states right now to prevent U.S. students from being taught the complete history of racial hatred in the United States. If you were educated in U.S. schools, you were probably taught that slavery was bad, but that Abraham Lincoln ended it, and then everything was equal after that, outside of a few isolated incidents in the South. You likely learned about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., and that's it. In terms of non-monetary affirmation or acknowledgement, a resolution was passed in 2008 by the House of Representatives to formally apologize for slavery. The Senate never got around to passing such a measure. And we do have holidays such as Juneteenth, MLK Day, and Black History Month. And the National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. that was erected in 2016 is the first large-scale, federally funded museum built to celebrate Black history and culture in the United States. But it's clear that the answer to the initial question, has the U.S. atoned for slavery, is no. The U.S. has come nowhere near atoning for slavery, or Jim Crow segregation, or redlining, or gerrymandering, or multiple race massacres. We've seen historically that nations do not atone for such things of their own free will. It takes massive organization, pressure, and money from well-connected advocacy groups to establish those precedents. Whether that day will ever come for Black American descendants of slavery has yet to be revealed.